The poet was quite overwhelmed by all this, and did not know what to do. She did not understand the feelings that were growing inside of her heart, and in being in such close proximity to the girl who had sparked them was dangerous. It must have been dangerous. Her heart was a powder keg, and this girl's smile was brighter than the flames that flickered in her fireplace. If she allowed it, her poor heart would explode. I'm sorry, but the poet stuttered. You, the dancer repeated mischievously. The poet was so enamored she nearly bit off the tip of her own tongue. It had been such a long time since she had spoken to another human being, and it was all too much for her. I am afraid I do not have any money, said the poet apologetically. But the dancer merely rolled her eyes and said, her tone dismissive, "You don't need to give me money, silly. I'm offering." This was not enough to placate the poet, however, for she demurred. But it would be rude, surely. I do not expect you to dance for my sake for free. The dancer pouted. You were looking at me so reverently, though, like I was some kind of goddess. I think that's payment enough. I'm sorry, but... For the first time in her life, the poet was close, dangerously close, to getting what she wanted. But this thought was terrifying. Change was terrifying. The feelings blossoming inside her chest were terrifying. So she left. She had no other choice. That was what she told herself, but her heart was pounding. The rest of the day, the poet wondered. She did not know why she loved the dancer so. They had hardly spoken, and the poet was a reticent person by nature. She was not the sort to fall for perfect strangers. Indeed, she had always scoffed at fairy tales with their neat, happily ever after endings, because these princes and princesses often married without knowing the first thing about one another. That was not love, that was obsession. Maybe the poet did not love the dancer then. Maybe it was obsession, sick and twisted and unhealthy. It was because, throughout the day, the dancer was the only one who paid the poet any attention. She was the only one who seemed to care. But that was nothing more than foolishness. If the dancer cared, that was because she wanted the poet to give her money. That was the logical conclusion, one that general dislike and mistrust of other humans had taught the poet. And yet... I'm afraid I don't have any money. You don't need to give me money, silly. I'm offering. From that day on, whenever the poet tried to compose any poetry, her thoughts would invariably return to the dancer. Now love, or if it was not love, obsession, can do strange things to people. Though the poet was shy, retiring sort, and hitherto would never have ventured into the outside world of her own volition, she was now driven. It was almost as though she had been cursed. She had to see the dancer again, otherwise she feared she would die. The following week, the poet found herself wandering the streets. She walked awkwardly, with the gait of one unused to the outside world. Her hands were held at her front, and she glanced about, as though expecting to be set upon by any moment. She made her way to the square where she had first seen the dancer, but to her immense disappointment, the dancer was not there. Perhaps that was to be expected. Street performers did not have fixed schedules, and often they did not have fixed addresses. The girl may not have even been a permanent resident of the village. What if she had already left and was now sharing her skills with the villagers of Charlotte or Viennoiserie? That was only to be expected, really, but this thought hurt rather more than it should have done. Sorry. The poet turned, defeated, ready to make her way back home, when... "Oh my," a familiar voice trilled. "Were you waiting for me?" The poet could only stare in shock, as well she might. You would have done much the same if, standing before you, was the very object of your affections. The dancer, with her striking makeup and long silken hair. "You know," said the dancer, "I've been doing street performances for years, but I've never had a fan before." A fan?" asked the poet, blinking at her shyly. "That's right. You are a fan, aren't you?" I don't know what you mean." "Of course you don't. This is just a coincidence. We just so happened to run into one another." "Mm-hmm," said the dancer, nodding her pretty little head. So, my number one not fan, would you care to watch me a while? The poet looked at her anxiously. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. You want me to? Of course. Dancing is rather depressing when there's nobody around to appreciate your art. But the streets are filled with people, and... The poet's voice trailed off. She shied away. In any case, you're so pretty. Everyone will want to watch you. They watch, but that does not mean they see. They are not watching the dance, but my legs, or my hips, or my chest. The dancer shook her head. But you're different. I could tell that from the start. I don't think so, but if you want me to, The poet flushed. I suppose I could watch you, just for a while. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, the dancer beamed. Her whole face was glowing. Suddenly, without warning, the dancer pulled the poet into a hug. The embrace was unexpected, and the poet tensed when she felt the lithe, supple arms of the dancer wind around her waist. The dancer smelled of peppermint, soft and sweet. As for the poet, what did she smell of? Dust motes, most likely, and old parchment. Ink, too. The tips of her fingers were still blackened from a feverish night of writing, and there were bags beneath her eyes. She could not return the dancer's embrace, lest she smeared the dress with smuts of ink, but that did not mean she did not want to. She had never wanted anything more acutely in her whole life. So, my number one not fan, said the dancer coyly when she had drawn away from the poet. Do you have a dance request for me now? And to her surprise, the poet did. The erstwhile lover. The dancer danced so very sweetly, the poet could almost bring herself to believe she was really dancing for her. When the poet returned to her study, she pressed the palms of her hands against her cheeks covertly, warming them with the strength of her own ardor. It was embarrassing to care so deeply after a long, weary life of not caring at all, but the poet embraced it, even though it hurt. Even though she knew undoubtedly the dancer did not return her affections. She could not. Why would anybody love a reclusive person like her? But that did not stop the poet from meeting the dancer over and over again. During the months, the two struck up a kind of friendship. The poet would go and watch the dancer, and the dancer would always fulfill the poet's requests with a small smile on her face. She was always, without fail, the erstwhile lover. Is there a reason why you like this dance so much? The dancer at once had cause to ask, with one of her mischievous smiles. The two were sitting together in the local tavern, drinking. Perhaps the poet had had too much to drink already. She had always been bad at holding her liquor, and her cheeks were flushed. They flushed even deeper upon hearing the dancer's question. The poet looked at the tabletop, trembling like a lily. She could hardly tell the dancer she enjoyed the dance because it allowed her to imagine, if only for a few moments, the love and adoration resplendent upon the dancer's face was meant for her and her alone. Being an artist herself, the poet understood the dancer's true motivations. The love that shone upon her face during the dance was not meant for her. It was for the art of dance itself. I just think it looks beautiful, that's all, said the poet. But the dancer was not placated by this obvious dodge. Oh, is that all? She asked, nudging the poet in the ribs. It is the truth, the poet squeaked. The dancer peered at her, smiling that mischievous smile the poet had come to know even better than her own. Of course the poet knew the dancer's smile more intimately than hers. She had never smiled herself, after all, and even if she did, she was not the sort of person who cared to look at her reflection in the mirror. She was far too pale and sickly. If that is so, then why is your face red? Asked the dancer. The poet stuttered helplessly. I must have had too much apple cider. Apple cider? The dancer raised an eyebrow. How can you even get drunk on that? It's a woman's drink. We're both women, the poet countered weakly. The dancer, however, paid the traveler's feeble protests no heed. She laughed, shaking her head. You're kind of adorable, you know. I am? Yes, you get flustered so easily, the dancer giggled ominously. It makes me want to tease you. But please don't, the woebegone poet replied, her head bowed. No. But the poet was shifting a little in her seat, anxious and expectant. When the dancer said she wanted to do something, she was the kind of person who did it. even if that something involved the unfair and wholly unnecessary teasing of her sensitive friend. "You don't sound very convinced," the dancer pressed. "Well, if it's you," the poet flushed, abashed by her own honesty, "maybe I don't mind being teased, just a little." "Now that is what I like to hear. This is why we're such good friends, you and me." "Because you like bullying and I'm easy to bully?" Granted, the poet was not well versed in human relations, but it did not seem like the most stable foundation to build a friendship on. But there was more. Of course there was more. The dancer made a show of thinking, one finger tapping against her lower lip. Her fingernails, the poet noticed, were a pale peachy pink, neatly filed and cut into perfect crescent moons. For some reason, these perfect fingernails were depressing. "And you're incredibly cute," the dancer suddenly exclaimed. "What?" the poet started. It was fortunate she was not drinking. If she had been, a fine spray of apple cider would have gone everywhere. Now that would have endeared her to the dancer, she did not think. "But please don't tease me," the poet begged. "Who says I'm teasing you?" It's just so unlikely. I'm not cute." "Are too," the dancer insisted stubbornly. The poet looked at her dubiously. You say the cider is a woman's drink, but I think you're drunk too," she said. "Nonsense." But you said I was cute." "You are cute, and I'll prove it." "How?" "Like this." Quicker than lightning, the dancer bridged the gap between them and pressed her lips against the poet's cheek. "Ah," the poet squeaked. Predictably, she flustered. Her eyes were as wide as gold pieces. With a trembling hand, she brought her fingertips to her right cheek and let them rest there. She was so awkward, uncoordinated. She very nearly managed to knock her tankard of apple cider over in the process. But could you really blame her? The dancer, her dearest friend and her objects of her affection, had just kissed her. What did it mean? The poet did not know. She was happy at this display of affection, of course, but at the same time she was horribly anxious. What of their relationship now? What if it changed? Before she met the dancer, the poet had been unbearably lonely. She had not even realized the full extent of her own loneliness because she had been lonely all her life. The loneliness had become a dull background hum like falling rain. Her constant companion. Now that the poet knew what it was like not to be lonely, she did not know if her heart could handle the deep, unchecked loneliness of her past. Her heart was a frail, fragile organ, and it tensed in pain when she was parted from the dancer. Some nights she would clutch her chest, her eyes woven shut from pain, and whimper. Loving somebody was one of the most wonderful feelings in the world, but not being loved in return was agony. Being toyed with was worse. It felt like her heart was being lacerated by glass, and the mere act of breathing hurt. Sometimes the poet wished she had never met the dancer. Then she would never have learned what it was to love, and subsequently she would never have learned what it was like to suffer. But she knew that it was folly. Even if she had the chance to go back in time, she would not have done anything differently. She would have met the dancer again, over and over, across thousands of different lifetimes. If only she could have told the dancer that, but her lips remained sealed shut. All she could do was pine and pour the depths of her heart into her poems. The dancer herself seemed curious in the poet's works, and asked her numerous questions about her professions. "What is it that you do?" she clamored. "Tell me, tell me." Invariably, however, the poet would reply with, It's a secret." "Does that mean you don't trust me?" It's not that, but I don't know if it's a very respectable job." The dancer would only scoff to these replies, saying, "In case you haven't noticed, I am a street performer. I dance in public, hoping against hope some kindly man or woman will give me some spare change." "Well," the poet demurred, "you have no reason to feel embarrassed. You can tell me," the dancer pressed. "But your dancing is beautiful, whereas the poet bowed her head, closing her eyes. "I have only ever used my talents for selfish purposes." "What talents? I want to know. Aren't we friends?" "Well, The poet hid her face. Admitting that she was a poet was excruciating, as it so often is for those who wish to make a living through the written word. It is far too personal. Yet at the same time, the poet wanted the dancer to know. "I write poems, I suppose," she admitted, her cheeks pale pink. To her relief, the dancer did not scorn her chosen career. Instead, she clapped her hands together, her face shining. "Poems? Oh my, that really does suit you." You think?" "Yes, you seem like exactly the kind of person who would exist in some dusty library, poring over old books with a quill in your hand." I am not sure if I'm flattered about this assessment or not," said the poet. "It's a compliment," said the dancer, giggling. "But a poet, I wonder." What was she wondering exactly? The poet was curious, but at the same time she was a little anxious. Even so, she still asked, "What are you wondering?" The dancer's eyes lit up. With a wide smile, she took hold of the poet's hands in her own. Her fingers were soft and warm. "Have you written any poems about me?" The poet backed away, though it did little good, given their fingers were still intertwined. The poet stuttered. "You have?" asked the dancer. "No." "Don't lie to me, my #1 not fan. I can tell," said the poet, waving one finger in a reprimanding manner. "If you have been profiting off my beauty, why don't you let me look? I want to see what you've been writing about me." But the poet could not. She opened and closed her mouth, but no voice came out. It was too embarrassing. Poems can be rather revealing, crafted by stripping back layers upon layers of the heart and arranging them prettily on paper. The poet did not want the dancer to see the true depths of her feelings. She would rather die. She refused. She had to. "Well," the dancer's expression, once so jubilant, fell, "if you don't trust me." But that wasn't it. It wasn't that the poet did not trust the dancer. The poet did not trust herself. Though her poetry had never been more evocative than it was now, that only made the poet even more defensive of her works. Ow. I just hit myself in the face. 'Cause I'm dumb. Falling in love seemed to have a positive effect on her poetry. Though the poet had published a handful of poems before, they had met with little acclaim. They were too morose and melancholy, with no softer moments to break them up. A long, endless slog. If the girl's poems had been miserable, that was only to be expected. She herself had been miserable, and she had known few other emotions. A writer can create the most expansive of fantasy universes populated with any number of colorful characters, but they cannot come to life without emotion. Upon meeting the dancer, the poet's heart was suddenly seized with any number of curious feelings she had never had before. There was happiness, yes, and relief and pleasure, warmth, acceptance, belonging. But there were other darker emotions mixed in: anxiety, insecurity, jealousy, and a deeper, darker, bitter loneliness than she had ever experienced. It was with these emotions that the poet created her new works, and they were well received. They were raw and passionate, almost obscenely so, and people were enamored. During her life, the poet spent so many stories that attained acclaim and lofty accolades, but the one thing she wanted to say the most, she could not. She could not tell the truth. She could not tell the dancer she loved her. She could not even let the dancer read her poems. Time passed, as it always does, and the halcyon days the poet had spent with her beloved dwindled away like autumn leaves. The dancer told her the news one day when they were in the local tavern, sipping at tankards of apple cider. The same apple cider they had been drinking together, the dancer giggling tipsily when they had shared their first and last kiss. A chaste kiss on the cheek, scented with sliced apples. The dancer hadn't been serious, or had she? The poet didn't know. She had never asked, and now it was too late.